The television flickered on its own, casting a dim, pale light that pulsed irregularly across the darkened living room. I hadn't touched a remote. It was sitting on the coffee table, its plastic surface glinting in the faint glow. My chest tightened, a prickling sensation crawling up the back of my neck as the screen sputtered, the static resolving into an image so sudden it made me flinch. It was a room, dimly lit and completely unfamiliar. The camera didn't move. Now, it was static, locked in place, angled downward as though someone had mounted it high on the wall. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary living room, maybe from an older house. The wallpaper was faded, peeling at the edges, and the furniture was sparse, mismatched, and covered in a thin layer of dust. A clock hung crooked on the wall, its hands frozen at midnight. The hum began then, low and steady, a sound just beneath the threshold of hearing. It buzzed in my skull, not loud but intrusive, worming its way into my thoughts. The image on the screen didn't change, but there was something wrong with it, something I couldn't place. The room was too still, too quiet, like the silence that settles right before a storm. I leaned forward, my fingers hovering over the remote. I should have turned it off, but I didn't. Something about the scene on the screen wouldn't let me look away. My pulse quickened as the hum grew louder, sharper, and I noticed something I hadn't before. Movement. It was subtle at first. A flicker of shadow in the corner of the room, near the edge of the frame. I told myself it was the camera glitching, a trick of the light. But the shadow moved again, deliberate and slow. My breath caught. It wasn't just a shadow, it was a figure, tall and thin, its edges blurred and indistinct. It stood perfectly still for a moment, just inside the frame, before taking a step forward. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. The hum deepened, vibrating in my chest, and my hand instinctively reached for the remote. This time, I grabbed it, my thumb pressing hard against the power button. The screen didn't turn off. Very well, honey, you didn't turn off. The figure kept moving, its gait slow but deliberate, each step bringing it closer to the camera. My heart pounded as I pressed the button again. Harder this time, but the screen remained lit, the scene playing out as though it were independent of the television itself. Wah! I stood, my legs shaky, and moved toward the TV, my reflection faintly visible in the dark glass surrounding the image. The figure stopped. It was close now, its face obscured by the shadows of the room, but its outline was clear. It was watching me, its head tilted slightly, as though studying me through the screen. My throat went dry as it raised a hand, its long spindly fingers curling in a motion that could only be described as beckoning. The hum was deafening now, a physical force that pressed against my chest, and the air in the room grew cold, sharp, as though the temperature had plummeted in an instant. I backed away, my foot catching on the edge of the coffee table, sending me stumbling. The screen flickered, the figure vanishing for a split second before reappearing closer, its distorted form filling nearly the entire frame. And then the audio started. It wasn't a voice. At least, not one I could understand. It was a garbled, static-laden sound. A mix of whispers and low guttural tones that didn't form words but carried meaning nonetheless. My head throbbed with the weight of it, and I clamped my hands over my ears, desperate to block it out. But it didn't stop. The figure on the screen raised both hands now, reaching for something unseen. Its movements more frantic, more desperate. The whispers turned to screams. Ah. Elul. Eimua. Baptiul. The clock on the wall behind the figure began to move, its hands spinning wildly before stopping again at midnight. The figure froze, its head snapping toward the camera, and I realized it wasn't looking at me, it was looking through me, its gaze fixed on something behind me. I turned, my body moving before my brain could process what I was doing. The living room was empty. The shadows stretched long and thin across the walls, and the hum persisted, vibrating through the floor beneath my feet. My eyes darted to the windows, the doors, every corner of the room, but there was nothing there. When I turned back to the TV, the screen was blank, just static now, the faint crackle of white noise filling the silence. My heart was racing, my chest heaving as I tried to steady my breathing. I reached for the remote again, my hand trembling. And this time when I pressed the power button, the screen went dark. The room was silent, too silent. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the blank screen, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The air was still, the shadows unmoving, and the hum was gone. I told myself it was over, that it had to be over. But when I turned to leave, I froze. The television flickered to life again, the static clearing to reveal the same room as before. The clock was there, its hands still stuck at midnight, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker, deeper. My blood ran cold as the camera angle shifted for the first time, panning slowly toward the far corner of the room. There, on the floor, was a body. It was face down, motionless, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles. The light from the television cast long, flickering shadows across its form, highlighting the dark pool spreading beneath it. My stomach churned, and I stumbled back, my mind racing. I didn't recognize the room, but the longer I stared, the more familiar it felt. The wallpaper, the furniture, even the clock. It all tugged at something deep in my memory. And then the camera zoomed in, the image sharpening, and I realized why. The body on the floor was wearing my clothes. M2V. The screen went black. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. The figure, the room, the body, my body. The image burned itself into my mind, so vivid that it felt more like a memory than something I had seen on the screen. The silence in my apartment wasn't comforting. It was oppressive. Faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards only made it worse. Like the house itself was alive, waiting. I'd to convince myself it was a prank or a hallucination. Maybe I was overtired. Maybe it was some bizarre broadcast interference. But none of it made sense. There was no reason for the TV to turn on by itself. No explanation for why the figure had moved the way it did. No way to rationalize what I'd seen in that final horrifying moment. And then there was the worst part. The familiarity. I didn't just see that room. I felt like I'd been in it before. By the time the sun rose, I'd convinced myself to forget about it, to treat it like a bad dream. I went about my day like normal, showered, dressed, forced myself to eat something. But the feeling didn't go away. Every shadow in my apartment seemed darker than it should be. Every noise sharper, like the world had shifted slightly off balance. My reflection in the mirror looked wrong, like it wasn't quite following me. I avoided it as much as I could. Why? I spent the day distracted, unfocused. At work, my co-workers' voices blended into background noise, and the glow of my computer screen felt too harsh, too invasive. By the time I got home, I was exhausted, desperate for some kind of relief. But the unease only grew worse as the sun dipped below the horizon. The apartment felt different at night, as though the walls had moved closer. The air heavier. I avoided the living room, the television, but that only made the rest of the apartment feel emptier. The shadows crept along the walls, stretching toward me, no matter how many lights I turned on. The hum was back, faint but unmistakable, vibrating through the air like a distant electrical current. I turned on music, then the fan, anything to drown it out. But it was still there, under everything, a constant reminder of what I couldn't escape. When the clock struck midnight, the television turned on. I wasn't in the living room this time. Endel, Sue, Shobhatinkani. I was in bed, trying to force myself to sleep. But the moment I heard the faint click of the power switching on, my blood ran cold. The light from the screen spilled into the hallway, pale and flickering. My heart pounded in my chest, and my body froze. Every instinct screaming at me to stay where I was, to ignore it. But I couldn't. I slid out of bed, my feet silent against the floor, and moved toward the living room. The hum grew louder with each step, a deep vibration that seemed to pull me forward. The screen glowed brightly, the static clearing to reveal the same room as before. And my stomach twisted at the sight of it. The clock was still there, stuck at midnight. The shadows in the corners darker and more defined. This time, the camera angle was different. It was lower, as though the camera had been moved closer to the ground, tilted slightly upward. The room was empty at first. No figure, no movement, but the shadows seemed alive, writhing at the edges of the frame. I held my breath, waiting, dreading what would come next. The figure appeared slowly, emerging from the far corner of the room. Its movements were smoother now, more deliberate, and its form was clearer, though still wrong in ways I couldn't quite describe. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was solid, tangible, but its edges flickered, as though it couldn't fully maintain its shape. It turned toward the camera, its head tilting slightly, and I felt its gaze lock onto me, even through the screen. The hum shifted, growing deeper, sharper, and then the audio began again. The whispers were louder this time, overlapping, incomprehensible, but filled with an urgency that made my chest tighten. My hands clenched into fists at my sides, nails digging into my palms as I fought the instinct to turn and run. The figure stepped closer, its movements almost human, but not quite, as though it were mimicking something it didn't fully understand. The light from the screen flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. And I realized, with a sinking feeling, that one of those shadows wasn't mine. It moved independently, stretching toward me, even as I stood frozen in place. The screen flickered again, and the room on the television began to change. The walls buckled, the wallpaper peeling away to reveal something darker beneath, something wet and pulsating, like flesh. The clock shattered, its hands spinning wildly before disappearing completely. The figure reached for the camera, its spindly fingers brushing against the lens, and for a moment, everything went still. Then, it spoke. The voice wasn't human. It was layered, distorted, a guttural sound that made my skin crawl. The words weren't in any language I knew, but I understood them anyway. You are seen. The television screen erupted into static, the sound deafening, and the shadow lunged toward me. I stumbled back, my foot catching on the coffee table as I fell hard onto the floor. The air in the room grew colder, sharper, and the hum reached a pitch so high it felt like my skull was splitting open. My vision blurred, the room spinning around me, and when I blinked, the screen was dark again. The static was gone. The hum had stopped. But the room wasn't empty. The figure stood in the corner, barely visible in the faint lights, spilling through the window. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just watched, its head tilted slightly, as though waiting for me to do something. My chest heaved, and I scrambled backward, my hands slipping against the floor, but the figure didn't follow. It stayed perfectly still, its presence suffocating, and then, slowly, it raised a hand. Its fingers were impossibly long, ending in sharp, jagged points, and it reached toward the television. The screen flickered back to life, and the room on the other side was no longer empty. There was a figure on the floor now, face down, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles. The shadows in the room grew darker, deeper, until they consumed everything but the body. And as the camera panned closer, I saw the reflection of my apartment in the shattered glass of the clock on the wall. The reflection in the shattered glass wasn't just an image. It was a doorway, pulling me closer with an invisible force I couldn't resist. The hum returned, low and insistent, crawling under my skin and wrapping around my bones. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning out the sound of my own ragged breathing. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen, even as every fiber of my being screamed at me to run. The body on the television moved. It was subtle at first, a twitch of a hand, a shift in the angle of a leg, but there was no mistaking it. The twisted figure began to straighten, its limbs contorting unnaturally as it pushed itself upright. The shadows in the room thickened, pressing against the edges of the screen, and the camera zoomed in closer, too close, until all I could see was its face. Or what should have been its face. There were no eyes, no mouth, no features, just a smooth, pale surface, like skin, stretched over bone. But it wasn't empty. Something moved beneath it, rippling like liquid, as though 1,000 unseen eyes were watching me from inside. My chest tightened as the figure tilted its head toward the camera, its featureless face somehow radiating a cold, calculating intent. It raised one hand, its fingers long and spindly, each tipped with a sharp black claw. The movement was deliberate, slow, and it pointed directly at me through the screen. My breath caught as the shadows behind it surged forward, spilling out of the television like smoke. They curled around the edges of the screen, dark tendrils stretching toward the floor, and the hum grew louder, sharper, vibrating through my skull. The first tendril touched the carpet, and the air in the room shifted. It grew heavier, colder, the scent of burning ozone filling my nostrils. My body was frozen, every muscle locked in place, as the shadows crept closer, slithering across the floor like living things. The figure on the screen didn't move, but its presence filled the room, oppressive and inescapable. The shadows reached my feet, curling around my ankles with a cold, wet touch that made my stomach lurch. My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the floor, my hands scrambling against the carpet as though I could claw my way back. The tendrils tightened, pulling me closer to the television, and I could feel the static crawling up my skin, electric and alive. The screen flickered again, and the scene shifted. The room was gone, replaced by a corridor bathed in sickly green light. The walls were lined with old flickering televisions, each one displaying a different image. A forest engulfed in flames, a deserted playground under a blood-red sky, a figure standing motionless in the center of a field of graves. The hum became a chorus of whispers, overlapping and indistinct, their words slipping through my mind like water through cracks. The corridor stretched endlessly, the televisions blinking and shifting as though they were alive. I felt the pull again, stronger this time, dragging me forward. My hands clawed at the floor, but the shadows around my ankles held firm, their grip cold and unrelenting. The screen at the end of the corridor grew brighter, its glow searing into my vision, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they became a single voice. "Keep watching. Hi." The words echoed in my skull, a command that left no room for disobedience. My body moved on its own, my hands and knees scraping against the carpet as I was dragged closer to the television. The figure on the screen stepped forward, its head tilting as though it were studying me. The shadows around it writhed and pulsed, their edges sharp and jagged, and for a moment I thought I saw something in the darkness behind it, something massive and unending, a presence that made the air around me crackle with static. The screen filled with static, and the pull stopped. The room was silent, the air thick with tension, and for a brief fleeting moment I thought it was over, but then the screen cleared, and I saw myself. I was standing in the center of the corridor, surrounded by the flickering televisions. My reflection distorted and warped. My movements weren't my own. They were slower, stilted, like a puppet on strings. My head turned toward the camera, my eyes wide and empty, and I raised a hand, pointing directly at myself. The whispers surged again, overlapping into a chaotic roar, and the reflection in the screen began to smile. The static burst from the television, the light filling the room, and I screamed as the shadows engulfed me. The scream was ripped from my throat, but no sound came out. The shadows consumed everything. Light, air, even the weight of my own body. For a moment, there was nothing but a suffocating, infinite blackness. I couldn't feel the floor beneath me, or the pull of gravity. I was suspended, weightless, lost in a void that stretched endlessly in every direction. Then the whispers returned. They started faint, a chorus of fragmented voices threading through the darkness, each one overlapping the next. Their tones were impossible to distinguish, some pleading, others mocking, all of them invading my thoughts like a tide I couldn't hold back. They weren't just speaking, they were telling stories, recounting moments of fear, pain, and despair. None of them belonged to me, but they felt like they did, each memory sinking into my mind like a hook. The blackness around me shifted, rippling like liquid, and I realized I wasn't alone. Shapes emerged from the shadows, faint and indistinct at first, but then sharper, more defined. They weren't human. Twisted, elongated forms drifted through the void, their limbs too long, their movements jagged and wrong. They didn't approach me, but their presence was oppressive, their shapes flickering like static as they moved. The whispers grew louder, and the void began to warp. A faint glow appeared in the distance, casting pale, sickly light over the darkness. The shapes recoiled, retreating into the shadows, and I felt the first touch of solid ground beneath my feet. It was cold, smooth, and unyielding, stretching out in all directions like an endless expanse of polished stone. The light grew brighter, and with it came a new sound, a low, rhythmic hum, deep and resonant, vibrating through the air and into my chest. It was the same hum I'd heard before, but now it felt alive, pulsing in time with the faint tremors beneath my feet. Ahead of me, the glow coalesced into something tangible. A door. It was massive, carved from dark, weathered wood, its surface etched with intricate patterns that seemed to move when I looked directly at them. Symbols I didn't recognize glowed faintly along the edges, their light pulsating in sync with the hum. The door felt ancient, a presence in and of itself, and as I stepped closer, the air grew colder, sharper, like the space around it was drawing energy from the void. My feet moved on their own, each step slow and deliberate, until I stood directly in front of the door. The symbols flared brighter, their glow spilling onto the floor, and the whispers quieted, fading into a low, expectant murmur. My hand rose, trembling, and I pressed it against the wood. The moment my skin touched the surface, the door shuddered. The hum grew louder, the cymbals burning with an intense white light, and the ground beneath me trembled as though the void itself was reacting to my presence. The door creaked open, the sound low and mournful, and the light spilled through, flooding the darkness with a blinding intensity. I stepped inside. The room beyond was nothing like I'd expected. It was vast and circular, its walls lined with countless televisions stacked haphazardly, their screens flickering with static. Wires snaked across the floor, intertwining and disappearing into the walls, and the air buzzed with the faint crackle of electricity. The hum was louder here, almost deafening, and it seemed to emanate from the largest screen at the center of the room. The screen was different from the others. Its surface wasn't glass, but something darker, shinier, like polished obsidian. It didn't flicker or pulse like the others. It was still, silent, waiting. My reflection stared back at me, distorted and warped, and as I stepped closer, the edges of the screen rippled like water. The whispers surged, their voices frantic, desperate, as though warning me to stop, but I couldn't. The pull was too strong, the screen too captivating. Entered coendi stiu shell. I would have bow. My hand reached out, brushing against the surface, and the moment I made contact, the screen erupted with light. The images came in a flood, fractured, chaotic, and overwhelming. Faces I didn't recognize but felt I should. Places I'd never been, but knew intimately. A house burning against a starless sky. A figure standing at the edge of a cliff, its silhouette sharp against the void below. A clock, its hands spinning wildly before stopping at midnight. Each image was accompanied by a surge of emotion. Fear, guilt, despair that slammed into me with the force of a tidal wave. The screen went dark, and the room fell silent. I staggered back, my breath ragged, my chest heaving, and then I saw it. The figure. It stood at the far end of the room, its tall, thin frame outlined against the flickering glow of the televisions. Its face, or the void where its face should have been, was turned toward me, and though it had no eyes, I could feel its gaze piercing through me. The shadows at its feet writhed and twisted, spilling across the floor like smoke, and the hum shifted, becoming a low, resonant growl. The figure raised a hand, its long, spindly fingers pointing toward the central screen. The obsidian surface rippled again, and new images appeared. Images of me. I was sitting in my apartment, staring at the television. I was standing in the corridor, lined with flickering screens. I was here, in this room, reaching for the screen. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, and the shadows surged forward, coiling around my feet, my legs, pulling me toward the screen. The hum grew louder, the symbols on the walls flaring brighter, and the whispers returned, their voices overlapping into a chaotic symphony. The screen rippled one final time, and a single line of text appeared, glowing faintly against the dark surface. This is how it begins. Ah, oh. The shadows dragged me forward, and the void swallowed me whole. The void wasn't silent this time. Su-su-tu. It pulsed with sound, a deep rhythmic vibration that reverberated through my chest, my skull, my thoughts. I couldn't tell if I was moving or falling, but the sensation of being pulled forward was undeniable. The shadows clung to me, their touch cold and slick, like oil seeping into my skin. I couldn't see them, but I felt them, pressing, wrapping, consuming. Then the sound changed. The hum fractured into something sharper, more piercing, like a scream stretched out and distorted until it was barely recognizable. It filled the void, slicing through the darkness and setting my teeth on edge. The shadows recoiled, retreating from my limbs, and for the briefest moment I felt weightless, untethered. The ground appeared beneath me without warning, hard and unyielding, and I collapsed onto it with a jarring thud. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed myself up, the coldness of the floor biting into my palms. The air was thick, heavy, laced with the faint metallic tang of static electricity. The shadows still lingered at the edges of my vision, restless, but no longer encroaching. The space around me was vast and endless, yet somehow claustrophobic. The walls, if they could even be called that, shifted and rippled like liquid, their surfaces reflecting faint, fractured images. Faces stared back at me, some familiar, others foreign, each one flickering like a faulty signal. Their mouths moved, but no sound came out, their expressions frozen in an eerie, eternal loop. In the distance, a faint glow broke through the darkness, pulsing in time with the hum that now seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The light wasn't warm or inviting. It was harsh, sterile, casting long, jagged shadows across the shifting floor. I didn't want to move toward it, but my feet carried me forward, each step slow and hesitant, as though the ground might vanish beneath me at any moment. The light grew brighter as I approached, revealing the source, another screen. It was massive, towering over me, its surface smooth and black, reflecting the faint light in unnatural, rippling patterns. The edges of the screen seemed to bleed into the darkness, as though it wasn't an object but a part of the void itself. The screen flickered, and an image appeared. It wasn't the room from before, or the corridor, or any of the other scenes that had burned themselves into my mind. This time, it was my apartment. The camera angle was fixed, wide, capturing the entire living room in stark, unnerving detail. Everything was exactly as I had left it, right down to the half-empty glass of water on the coffee table. Yet, I wasn't there. The room was empty. The image shifted, the camera panning slowly toward the hallway that led to my bedroom. My heart pounded as the screen zoomed in, the edges of the frame distorting. And for a moment, I thought I saw movement, a shadow passing just out of sight. The camera lingered, the hum growing louder, deeper, until it felt like the walls of the void were vibrating. Then the image changed again. It was the same apartment, the same room, but this time I was there, sitting on the couch, staring at the television, my expression blank, my body unnaturally still. The light from the screen cast sharp shadows across my face, highlighting the hollows of my eyes, the tightness of my jaw. I looked like a statue, lifeless, frozen in time. The whispers returned, faint and overlapping, threading through the hum. They weren't speaking to me this time. They were speaking about me, their fragmented words weaving together into something I couldn't quite understand. The shadows around me shifted, pressing closer, and the faces in the walls seemed to watch with a new intensity. The image on the screen flickered, and suddenly I moved. Not the real me, the me on the screen. My head tilted, my eyes narrowing as though I were listening to something. My hands twitched, fingers curling into fists, and my chest rose and fell in a sharp, deliberate motion. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and the me on the screen stood up, turning toward the camera. It was like looking into a mirror, but the reflection wasn't mine. It moved like me, looked like me, but there was something wrong, something hollow, something inhuman. Its eyes were empty, voids of swirling blackness that seemed to pull at the edges of the screen, warping the image around them. The figure stepped closer to the camera, its movements smooth and deliberate, and the shadows on the screen grew darker, deeper, spilling out into the edges of the frame. The whispers turned into a roar, the hum vibrating through my skull, and I stumbled back, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then the figure spoke. "Do you see now?" The voice was layered, distorted, echoing through the void like it came from everywhere at once. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a demand, a truth I couldn't escape. The figure reached out, its hand pressing against the screen, and the shadows surged forward, spilling out into the room. The cold hit me like a wave, the darkness wrapping around my legs, my chest, my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. As the shadows dragged me closer to the screen, the figure on the other side tilted its head, its empty eyes locking onto mine, and for the first time, I understood. It wasn't just watching me. It was becoming me. The shadows pulled me through the screen, and the world shattered into static. The static swallowed everything. It roared in my ears, louder than thought, louder than breath, until it wasn't just sound but sensation, clawing at my skin and filling my lungs like smoke. My body was weightless, suspended in the chaos, and for a moment I wasn't sure if I was falling or floating. The shadows had let go, but their absence didn't feel like freedom. It felt like abandonment, like the silence after the predator retreats, just before the strike. When the static cleared, I was standing again. The room around me was unfamiliar, but the sensation of being watched was suffocatingly familiar. It wasn't empty, Objects filled the space in disjointed, unnatural ways. A chair with its legs warped into spirals sat in the corner. A desk that seemed too long for its surface warped the perspective, and the walls pulsed faintly with the rhythm of a heartbeat. The air tasted wrong, metallic and sharp, like copper pennies and burnt wire. A single screen floated in the center of the room. Ah, unlike the others, this one wasn't framed or mounted. It simply hovered, its surface shimmering like liquid glass. The faint glow from its edges cast long, stretching shadows across the warped walls. And I could feel the pull again, that same relentless force drawing me closer. My legs moved without thought, my body obeying something deeper than instinct. When I was close enough to see my reflection in the screen, I stopped. My face stared back at me, but it wasn't mine, not entirely. The eyes were wrong, too wide, too dark, and the expression was cold, distant, like a stranger wearing my skin. I wanted to look away, but the screen rippled, and the image changed. It wasn't my reflection anymore. It was the apartment again, the same angle I'd seen before. But the room was different now. The lights were off, and the shadows were longer, darker, creeping across the walls like living things. The hum returned, low and resonant, vibrating through the air, and the screen zoomed in, focusing on the couch. I was there, or something that looked like me. The figure sat motionless, its head tilted slightly, its eyes fixed on something beyond the frame. The camera panned closer, the image distorting as the figure on the screen turned toward the lens. Its mouth moved, but no sound came out, just the faint crackle of static. Then the screen went dark. The room around me shifted, the walls groaning as they bent inward, their pulsating rhythm growing faster, more frantic. The air grew heavier, pressing against my chest, and the floor beneath my feet rippled like water. The hum deepened, resonating through my bones, and the shadows on the walls stretched toward me, curling like tendrils. The screen flickered back to life. But the image was different now. It was a hallway, dimly lit, lined with doors that seemed to stretch endlessly into the distance. Each door was slightly ajar, the spaces beyond them filled with flickering light and faint whispers. The camera moved down the hallway, slow and deliberate, pausing briefly at each door before continuing. I felt the pull again, stronger this time, and before I could stop myself, I reached out and touched the screen. The room dissolved around me. I was in the hallway now. I know. The air was colder here, sharp and biting, and the whispers were louder, threading through the air like a song I couldn't escape. The floor beneath me was smooth and black, reflecting the faint light from the doors, and the shadows stretched long and thin across the walls. Each step I took echoed, the sound swallowed quickly by the oppressive silence that followed. The first door creaked open as I passed, the sound sharp and deliberate. Inside, I saw a room I recognized. My bedroom, but it wasn't right. The bed was stripped bare. The walls were cracked and peeling, and the window was boarded up from the inside. The hum was louder here, vibrating through the floor, and the shadows in the corners seemed deeper, darker, as though they were watching me. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping into a chaotic murmur, and I turned away, stepping back into the hallway. The door slammed shut behind me, the sound reverberating through the air, and the lights above flickered, casting everything into momentary darkness. When they steadied, the hallway seemed longer, the shadows thicker, and the doors were closer together. Each door was a memory, or something pretending to be one. The second door showed me a park I hadn't visited in years, the swings swaying in an unseen breeze, the faint echo of laughter threading through the air. The third was a school hallway, its lockers dented and rusted, the faint smell of mildew and sweat lingering in the air. Each door opened without my permission, forcing me to confront moments I hadn't thought about in years. Fragments of a life that didn't feel like mine anymore. By the time I reached the end of the hallway, my chest was tight, my breaths shallow and uneven. The final door was different. It was larger than the others, its surface smooth and unmarked, and it pulsed faintly with the same rhythm as the walls. The whispers stopped. As I reached for the handle, the silence deafening in its absence, and my fingers hesitated, hovering over the cold metal. When I opened the door, the void greeted me. The screen was there, floating in the center of the endless blackness, its surface glowing faintly. The figure stood in front of it, its back to me, its head tilted as though watching the screen intently. The shadows around it writhed and twisted, their movements erratic, almost frantic, and the air crackled with static, sharp and electric. The figure turned slowly, its movements deliberate, and for the first time I saw its face. It was me. Not a reflection, not a distortion, but me. Every feature, every detail, perfect and exact, except for the eyes. They were empty, black voids that swirled with a depth I couldn't comprehend. It smiled, and the shadows surged forward, dragging me into the void. The shadows didn't just pull me into the void. They became the void. They weren't around me anymore. They were inside me, filling my lungs with their icy weight, threading through my veins, clawing into every thought, every memory. The space where I ended and the void began disappeared. I didn't know if I was moving, falling, or simply dissolving. My body felt distant, abstract, like it was no longer mine to control. Then there was light. It pierced the darkness in a single, sharp burst, slicing through the shadows like a blade. The light didn't warm me. It was cold, sterile, and so bright it burned. The shadows recoiled, retreating from my skin, peeling back layer by layer until I could feel my body again. I gasped for air, my chest heaving, the taste of static sharp on my tongue. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in the void anymore. I was standing in a room I didn't recognize. The walls were smooth and white, stretching upward into a ceiling that seemed impossibly far away. The floor beneath me was reflective, polished like glass, and my reflection stared back at me, warped and distorted. The air was silent, but it carried the weight of something immense, something watching. In the center of the room stood the screen. It, yeah, it was larger now, towering over me, its surface smooth and dark, rippling faintly as though it were alive. The hum returned, low and resonant, vibrating through the floor, and the air around the screen shimmered, distorting the space like heat rising from asphalt. My reflection was there again, but this time it wasn't mine. It was it, the figure, the thing that had taken my face. Edvua, I'll believe Nord, in Sutu. It stood still, watching me through the screen, its empty, swirling eyes locking onto mine. Its presence filled the room, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. My legs trembled, but I couldn't move, couldn't look away. The hum grew louder, sharper, vibrating through my skull. And then the reflection in the screen spoke. You've seen it now. You've become it. The words weren't spoken. They were inside me, raw and invasive, threading through my thoughts like venom. The screen rippled, and the reflection stepped forward, out of the glass, and into the room. It moved like me, walked like me, but it wasn't me. Its presence was wrong, the space around it warping with every step. It stopped inches away from me, its face mere inches from mine. I wanted to look away, but its gaze held me, those empty, swirling voids pulling me in, unraveling me. I could feel it peeling back the layers of who I was, exposing everything I'd tried to bury, every failure, every regret. The figure raised a hand, its fingers long and spindly, each tipped with sharp, jagged points. It touched my chest, just above my heart, and the cold spread instantly, radiating outward until my entire body was numb. The screen behind it flickered, and I saw myself on the other side, sitting on the couch in my apartment, staring blankly at the television. The reflection smiled. This is where it begins. This is where it ends. The cold in my chest turned to fire, sharp and searing, and I screamed, the sound swallowed by the hum. My vision blurred, the room spinning around me, and the figure stepped closer, its hand pressing harder against my chest. The screen flickered again, and I saw myself standing in the hallway, the doors lining the walls, each one leading to another fragment of who I was. The figure leaned in, its mouth inches from my ear, and whispered, "You can't leave. You never could." The fire consumed me, burning through every thought, every memory, until there was nothing left but the hum. The room dissolved, the light fading into darkness, and the figure stepped back, its face now indistinguishable from mine. I felt the weight of it, the truth, the inevitability, and when I looked into its eyes, I finally understood. I wasn't the one being watched. Mule, that I did you, the one being watched. I was the watcher. The screen went dark, and the hum stopped. For a moment, there was silence, the kind that pressed against your eardrums, so heavy it felt like sound would never return. Then slowly, the shadows began to stir, coiling and twisting, forming shapes that flickered and pulsed with faint, dim light. I turned to the screen, or maybe it turned to me. My reflection was there again, but this time it was just a reflection. My face stared back at me, blank and expressionless, but the eyes were different. They weren't mine anymore. They were empty, swirling, endless. The screen flickered once, and then it was gone. And so was the room, the shadows, the hum. Sylvie, the human. I was back in my apartment, sitting on the couch, the television off. The remote still sitting untouched on the coffee table. The air was still heavy, and the faint smell of static lingered in my nostrils. I stood slowly, my body aching, my chest tight, and walked to the window. The city stretched out below me, the lights flickering in the distance, and for a moment everything seemed normal. But then I saw it. A faint, rippling reflection in the glass. My reflection. Feel me. It smiled. And behind it, the screen flickered to life. The road was endless. You live there. I'll crave. It twisted and turned through dense forest, the trees growing closer together the farther we drove, their branches clawing at the edges of the sky. The GPS had given up hours ago, and our phones had no signal. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the tires crunching over gravel, punctuated by the occasional snap of a branch under the weight of the car. The sun was setting, and the sky burned with a deep orange glow, but the dense canopy above us stole most of the light. The feeling started then. An itch at the base of my neck, a low hum at the edge of my hearing. It wasn't loud enough to be real, but it wasn't nothing either. It was the kind of sensation you feel when someone is watching you, though there was no one around, just us and the endless trees. I rubbed at my neck, trying to shake it off, but the unease lingered, clinging like smoke. We should have turned back. There had been a fork in the road hours earlier, a sign so weathered it was impossible to read, its arrows pointing in both directions like a cruel joke. We'd chosen left. Left felt like the right choice at the time. But now, as the road narrowed and the trees thickened, it was clear we'd made a mistake. The first sign of the town was a faded gas station, its single pump leaning at an awkward angle like it might collapse if you looked at it too hard. The building behind it was boarded up, the windows dark, the roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. There was no sign of life, no cars, no movement, just the faint creak of the wind against the wooden boards and the rustle of leaves from the forest. We slowed, but didn't stop. Something about the gas station felt wrong, like it was holding its breath, waiting. The itch at the back of my neck grew stronger, and I found myself staring into the empty windows, expecting to see something staring back. But there was nothing, just shadows. Me. The town emerged from the trees, like a mirage. At first, it was just rooftops peeking through the foliage, but then the road widened, and we were surrounded by buildings. They were old, their paint faded and peeling, their windows clouded with grime. A general store with a sign that hung crookedly over the door. A diner with a neon sign that flickered weakly, the letters spelling out a name that had long since faded away. A post office with its door hanging open, the darkness inside yawning like a mouth. We stopped in the center of the town, unsure of what to do next. The silence was oppressive, the kind that made you want to whisper, even though there was no one around to hear. The air was still, heavy with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic and sharp that made my stomach twist. The lake was visible through the gaps between the buildings, its surface unnaturally still, a mirror reflecting the darkening sky. I stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel underfoot startlingly loud in the quiet. The others followed, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes darting nervously between the buildings. No one spoke. There was no need. We all felt it, the wrongness of this place. It wasn't just abandoned. It was forgotten, erased from the map and the minds of anyone who had ever known it. And yet, we were here. The first sound was a whisper, faint, almost too faint to hear, carried on the breeze from the direction of the lake. It didn't sound like a voice, not entirely. It was layered, like static from a radio station that couldn't quite tune in. I turned toward the sound, my heart hammering in my chest. But there was nothing, just the lake, its surface dark and unbroken, the mist creeping in from the edges like fingers reaching for shore. The others heard it too, their heads turned, their bodies stiffening, and I saw the same unease reflected in their eyes. But no one said a word, not about the sound, not about the shadows that seemed to shift in the corners of our vision, not about the way the air felt heavier the closer we got to the lake. We walked toward it anyway. The dock stretched out over the water, its wooden planks warped and splintered, the posts leaning precariously to one side. The mist was thicker here, swirling around our ankles, and the whispering grew louder, more insistent. I stepped onto the dock, the wood creaking under my weight, and stared into the water. It was too dark to see anything beneath the surface, but it wasn't empty. I could feel it, something alive, watching, waiting. The reflection came first. It wasn't mine. It stared back at me from the water, its eyes wide and hollow, its mouth twisted into a grin that didn't belong to my face. My chest tightened, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps as I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing on the slick wood. The others didn't notice. They were staring into the water, their expressions vacant, their bodies still. The whispering grew louder, the voices overlapping, building into a crescendo that filled my head with static. I clutched at my ears, trying to block it out, but it was inside me now, threading through my thoughts, pulling at the edges of my mind. The reflection in the water moved, its grin widening, and for a moment I thought it was going to pull itself free. Then I saw the hand. It reached up from beneath the surface, pale and skeletal, its fingers impossibly long, curling around the edge of the dock. The wood groaned under its weight, and the whispering stopped. The silence was worse, a void that pressed down on me, crushing the air from my lungs. The hand pulled, and another followed, and then a head, slick with water and covered in something dark and slimy. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. All I could do was watch as it emerged, its body long and twisted, its face impossibly human, and yet completely wrong. It stared at me, its hollow eyes piercing through the mist, and it smiled. The last thing I remember is the sound of the water breaking as it dragged me under. When I came to, I was coughing up water, my throat raw and burning as I gagged on the cold metallic taste. The lake was gone, or at least it felt like it. I wasn't on the dock anymore. I was lying on damp ground, my clothes soaked through, the chill seeping into my bones. Every breath felt like a fight, my lungs still heavy with whatever had dragged me under. The air was thick with mist, a swirling, choking fog that pressed against my skin and filled my nose with the sharp scent of rot. I tried to sit up, but my limbs were trembling, weak and unresponsive. My head spun, and for a moment I thought I was back in the water, drowning again. But then I felt the earth beneath my hands, soft, wet, and pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. That was when I realized I wasn't alone. I wasn't sure what I heard first, the shuffle of movement or the low guttural whisper, threading through the fog. It wasn't like the whispers from the lake. Those had been distant, fragmented, like a radio frequency just out of range. This was closer, sharper, every syllable deliberate, though I couldn't make sense of the words. It was speaking to me. I knew that much. I forced myself to look around, my eyes struggling to focus through the haze. Shapes loomed in the mist, indistinct and shifting, their edges blurred like shadows cast by flickering light. They weren't human. They were too tall, too thin, their limbs bending at unnatural angles. They moved slowly, almost lazily, their heads tilting as though observing me. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't obey. My muscles felt like lead, every movement sluggish and uncoordinated. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, filling the air with a chorus of dissonant voices that made my skin crawl. The shapes in the mist drew closer, their outlines becoming clearer. One of them stepped into the faint light. Its skin was pale and translucent, stretched taut over a skeletal frame. Dark vines pulsed beneath the surface, writhing like worms. Its face, or what was left of it, was a mockery of humanity. Its features half-formed, its mouth too wide and filled with jagged, uneven teeth. It didn't have eyes, just hollow sockets that seemed to drink in the light, leaving only darkness in their wake. It stopped a few feet away from me, its head tilting in a slow, deliberate motion. The whispers quieted, fading into a low hum that vibrated through the ground beneath me. The creature leaned closer, its movements jerky and unnatural, and I could feel its breath, cold and damp, like the air from an open grave. My voice was gone. My mind was screaming, but my throat was dry, my lips frozen. I couldn't look away, couldn't close my eyes. The creature raised a hand, its fingers impossibly long and tipped with claws that looked more like bone than keratin. It didn't touch me, it just hovered there, its claws inches from my face, trembling slightly, as though it was restraining itself. And then it spoke. The sound wasn't a voice. It was a vibration, a resonance that echoed in my skull and made my teeth ache. The words weren't in any language I knew, but I understood them nonetheless. You belong to it now. The mist around us thickened, swirling faster, and the creature stepped back, disappearing into the fog. The others followed, their shapes melting into the haze, their whispers fading with them. The air grew colder, heavier, and the ground beneath me trembled, a deep rhythmic pulse that matched the thudding of my heart. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaking beneath me. The fog parted slightly, enough for me to see where I was. The lake was still there, its surface dark and glassy, but it wasn't the same. The dock was gone, and the trees surrounding it were twisted and gnarled, their branches stretching toward the sky like skeletal hands. The town was nowhere in sight. I wasn't alone, though. Near the edge of the lake, I saw a figure. At first, I thought it was one of the creatures, but as I moved closer, I realized it wasn't. It was human, or at least, it looked human. A man, standing with his back to me, his shoulders hunched, his head tilted downward. His clothes were soaked, clinging to his thin frame, and his hands hung limply at his sides. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to stay back, but something about him drew me closer, a compulsion I couldn't resist. I called out to him, my voice hoarse and trembling, but he didn't respond. He didn't move. And every so comfortable. When I was close enough to touch him, he turned. His face was a reflection of my own. He knew the girl. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't just a resemblance. It was me. Every detail, every line, every scar. Gone, but the eyes were raw. They were empty, dark and hollow, swirling with the same shadows that filled the lake. He, or it, smiled. A slow, unnatural movement that stretched the skin of his face, too tightly over his bones. His head tilted to the side, and he raised a hand, pointing toward the water. I followed his gaze, my stomach twisting as I saw what he was pointing at. The surface of the lake rippled, and something began to rise from the depths. At first, it was just a shadow, an indistinct shape that grew larger and larger as it broke the surface. But then I saw it. It was me. Hell, to blast. Another me, and then another, and another. Dozens of them, all identical, their faces blank and emotionless, their eyes empty. They floated just beneath the surface, their arms outstretched, their fingers clawing at the air, as though trying to reach me. The whispering returned, louder and more urgent, the voices overlapping until they became a single, deafening roar. I backed away, my feet slipping on the wet ground. But the reflection stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. The copies in the water surged upward, their faces breaking the surface, and I felt the pull again, stronger this time, dragging me toward the lake. The reflection reached out, its hand brushing against mine, and the world dissolved into darkness. When the darkness lifted, I found myself back at the edge of the lake. My hands were pressed into the damp earth, the smell of wet moss and rotting leaves heavy in the air. The reflection was gone, but the feeling of its touch lingered, cold and sharp, like frostbite. My chest heaved with each shallow breath, and my head pounded as though something had been ripped from it. The lake was still again, its surface smooth and unbroken, a perfect mirror for the sky above. The mist swirled lazily around my feet, almost playful, like it was mocking me. I wanted to believe it was a dream, some feverish hallucination brought on by exhaustion, but the chill in my bones and the taste of iron on my tongue, it was real. It was real. Too real. I staggered to my feet, my legs unsteady, and scanned the shoreline for the others. The thought of being alone in this place was unbearable, but when I called out, my voice sounded hollow, swallowed by the mist before it could carry. There was no reply. No sound at all, except for the faint rustle of the breeze through the twisted trees. The forest loomed in the distance, dark and impenetrable, its shadows stretching toward the water like outstretched hands. Somewhere within it, I thought I saw movement, a flicker of something pale darting between the trees. My stomach twisted, but I couldn't look away. It was as though the shadows themselves were alive, watching me from just beyond the edge of the mist. A sound broke the silence, sharp and sudden, a splash. My head snapped back to the lake, and for a moment I saw nothing. Then the ripples appeared, small at first, spreading outward from the center of the water. Something was moving beneath the surface, its dark shape barely visible, but it was coming closer. My heart pounded in my chest, and I stumbled backward, my feet catching on the uneven ground. The shape disappeared, the water stilling once more. but the feeling of being watched intensified. The air grew heavier, colder, pressing against my skin like a physical weight. My breathing quickened, and I turned toward the forest, hoping against reason that the others had gone that way. The thought of staying by the lake any longer made my skin crawl. I stumbled into the trees, the underbrush catching at my ankles, the branches clawing at my arms and face. The deeper I went, the darker it became. The canopy above blotting out what little light remained. The whispers started again, faint at first, threading through the air like strands of silk. They weren't coming from any direction in particular. They were everywhere, surrounding me, seeping into my thoughts. The ground beneath my feet grew soft, spongy, and with each step, it felt as though I was sinking deeper. My head throbbed, the whispers growing louder, more distinct. They weren't just sounds, they were words, fragments of sentences that didn't belong to me, but felt painfully familiar. You can't leave, moi, and it's too late. You belong to it now. And the last words hit me like a physical blow, and I stopped, my legs trembling. My eyes darted through the darkness, searching for the source of the voices. But there was nothing there, just the trees, their gnarled branches reaching for the sky, and the mist coiling around their trunks like smoke. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was another shadow, one of the countless shapes that danced at the edge of my vision. But as I stared, it became clearer. A figure stood between the trees, its body impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted slightly, as though it were trying to see me better. But its face was obscured by the shadows. It didn't move. It didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to root me to the spot. My body frozen in place, as though the forest itself had reached out to hold me there. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, and I felt the cold again, creeping up my spine like ice. The figure stepped forward. Its movements were slow, deliberate, each step sending ripples through the mist that clung to the ground. The shadows seemed to bend around it, the trees leaning in as though they were drawn to it. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, their voices frantic, pleading, "Don't look, look. It's not real." It's already too late. The figure stopped a few feet away from me, its body half hidden by the mist. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a blank, featureless void, a hollow space that seemed to swallow the light around it. It raised a hand, its fingers impossibly long, and pointed at something behind me. "Be too hide." I didn't want to turn. Every instinct screamed at me to stay still, to keep my eyes fixed on the figure, but the compulsion was too strong. Slowly, I turned my head, the forest spinning around me in a blur. The lake was there. It shouldn't have been. I had walked away from it, deeper into the forest, but now it stretched out before me, its surface still and dark, the mist swirling over it like a living thing. And there, in the center of the lake, was the same figure, Or maybe it wasn't the same. Maybe it was another. It stood on the water as though it were solid ground, its head tilted in the same unnatural angle, its empty face locked on mine. The figure in the forest stepped closer, and I felt its breath, cold and damp, against my skin. My vision blurred, the whispers reaching a deafening pitch, and then everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on my back, staring up at a sky I didn't recognize. The trees loomed over me, their branches twisting together in unnatural patterns that blotted out the stars. The air was colder now, thick with the same suffocating mist, and the ground beneath me felt damp, almost alive, as though it were breathing in time with my own shallow gasps. I sat up slowly, every muscle in my body aching, and looked around. The forest was impossibly still, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears and made you desperate to fill it, even if only to hear the sound of your own voice. But I didn't dare make a sound. Not here. Shh. Not now. No, the figure was gone, but its presence lingered, a weight in the air that I couldn't shake. My thoughts were muddled, fragments of images flashing through my mind. The lake, the shadows, the reflection. It felt like I'd been torn apart and stitched back together. But the pieces didn't fit the way they were supposed to. I stood, my legs trembling, and turned in a slow circle. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, the trees warped and leaning, their bark blackened and cracked like they'd been burned. The mist clung to the ground, swirling lazily around my ankles, and the faint scent of rot lingered in the air. Then I saw it. A house stood at the edge of the forest, its silhouette barely visible through the fog. It was old, the wood warped and splintered, the windows dark and lifeless. The roof sagged in the middle, and the door hung crookedly on its hinges. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, but there was something about it. Something that made my stomach twist. I didn't want to go near it, but my feet moved on their own, each step pulling me closer. The air growing colder with every breath. The whispers began again, faint at first, threading through the trees like tendrils of smoke. They weren't the same as before. These were different, softer, almost pleading, but no less unsettling. The door creaked open as I approached, the sound sharp and jarring in the heavy silence. The darkness inside seemed alive, shifting and pulsing like a living thing. And the whispers grew louder, overlapping into a chaotic murmur that made my skin crawl. My heart pounded in my chest, and I stopped just short of the threshold, my breath fogging in the cold air. I didn't want to go inside. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run. But there was nowhere to go. The forest felt like it had closed in behind me. The trees leaning closer, their branches reaching for me like skeletal hands. I took a step forward, then another, the wooden floor groaning under my weight. The door slammed shut behind me. Evu, Eul. The sound echoed through the house, and the whispers stopped, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. The darkness pressed against me, thick and impenetrable, and I fumbled for my phone, desperate for any kind of light. The screen flickered on, casting a weak glow that barely illuminated the space around me. The room was empty. The walls were bare, the floor covered in a thin layer of dust that stirred with every step. There was no furniture, no sign that anyone had ever lived here, but the air was heavy with the feeling of something unseen, something waiting. I turned slowly, the light from my phone sweeping across the walls. Symbols were etched into the wood, faint but unmistakable, their jagged lines curling and intersecting in patterns that made my head ache to look at them. They weren't random. They meant something, though I couldn't begin to guess what. As I moved deeper into the house, the temperature dropped further, the cold biting into my skin. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, and my breaths came in short, shallow gasps. The light from my phone flickered, the screen dimming as though something was draining it, and the whispers started again, louder this time. "You shouldn't be here." The voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was loud, echoing through the empty house, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. My chest tightened, and I spun around, the light from my phone bouncing off the walls. The symbols seemed to glow faintly now, pulsing in time with the pounding in my head. A door at the far end of the hallway creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. The voice came again, sharper, more insistent. "You don't belong. Way." I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest, but the floorboards beneath me groaned, and I froze. Something moved in the darkness beyond the door. Something tall and thin, its shape indistinct but unmistakably human. It stepped forward, the light from my phone catching the edge of its form, and I felt my stomach drop. It was the figure from the lake. Use Honey Lake. Its face, or the absence of one, was exactly as I remembered, a blank, featureless void that seemed to drink in the light. Its body was wrong, too long, its limbs bending at unnatural angles, its movements slow and deliberate. It tilted its head as though studying me, and the whispers surged, filling the air with a deafening roar. "Leave. Die." The word was a command, but there was no escape. The house felt alive now, the walls pulsing, the floor shifting beneath my feet. The symbols on the walls burned brighter, their light casting jagged shadows that danced and writhed like living things. The figure took another step toward me, its hand reaching out, and the air grew colder, sharper, until I could barely stand. I turned and ran. The hallway stretched impossibly long, the door at the end seeming farther away with every step. The whispers chased me, their voices overlapping, screaming now, a cacophony of anger and desperation. The floor buckled beneath me, the walls closing in, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. When I finally reached the door, I threw it open, stumbling out into the forest. The mist enveloped me immediately, thick and suffocating, and I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. The whispers stopped, the cold receded, and when I looked back, the house was gone. The forest around me was suffocatingly still. The mist wrapped around my body like a shroud, damp and cold, clinging to my skin as I struggled to catch my breath. My heart hammered against my ribs, each beat a reminder that I was still alive, but barely. The ground beneath me was soft and spongy, like decayed flesh, and the faint metallic tang of blood hung in the air. The house was gone, just like that, as though it had never been there in the first place. I glanced back, half expecting to see the crooked door or the glow of the symbols etched into its walls. But there was nothing, just the endless expanse of twisted trees and creeping mist. My body ached as I forced myself to stand, every muscle trembling with exhaustion and fear. The whispers hadn't returned, but their absence wasn't comforting. It was the kind of silence that made you feel watched, hunted. The figure was gone too, or so I told myself. But I could feel it, lingering just beyond the edge of the mist, its hollow gaze fixed on me. I needed to keep moving. The forest seemed different now, its paths twisting in ways that defied logic. Every step I took felt like I was walking in circles, the trees leaning closer, their branches clawing at the sky. The air grew heavier, harder to breathe, and the mist thickened, swirling around my feet like it had a mind of its own. My footsteps were muffled, the ground swallowing the sound, and the shadows around me stretched and shifted, refusing to stay still. Then I heard it, a sound so faint I almost missed it. A voice, not the whispers this time, but something real, human. My heart leapt in my chest, and I turned toward the sound, my pulse quickening. It was distant, muffled, but unmistakable. Someone was calling out, their voice shaky and desperate, cutting through the oppressive silence. I stumbled toward the sound, my legs weak and unsteady, but the hope of finding someone, anyone, kept me moving. The voice grew louder as I pushed through the underbrush, the sharp branches tearing at my clothes and skin. The mist parted slightly, revealing a clearing up ahead, and I froze. There, in the center of the clearing, was one of the others. It was Sarah. Erin, Tunture. She was standing with her back to me, her shoulders hunched, her arms hanging limply at her sides. Her hair was damp, clinging to her face, and her clothes were soaked through, dark with water and mud. I called out to her, my voice breaking, but she didn't respond. She didn't move. Something was wrong. The clearing was eerily quiet, the air heavy with the same suffocating pressure I'd felt by the lake. The ground was bare, the grass wilted and blackened, as though the life had been drained from it. The mist swirled around Sarah's feet, curling upward like smoke, and the closer I got, the more I realized she wasn't alone. The shadows around her moved. They weren't like the ones in the forest. These were darker, denser, their shapes shifting and writhing like living things. They clung to her, coiling around her arms and legs, their edges sharp and jagged, cutting into her skin. Her head twitched slightly, her movements jerky, as though she were trying to fight them, but the shadows held her in place. I called her name again, louder this time, and she turned. Her face wasn't hers anymore. Her eyes were black, endless voids that swallowed the light, and her mouth twisted into a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, the veins beneath it dark and pulsing, and the shadows around her seemed to breathe, their edges flickering like flame. "It's too late," she said, her voice layered, distorted, as though someone else was speaking through her. "You can't save her." My stomach churned, and I stumbled back, my mind racing. This wasn't Sarah. It couldn't be, but the way she moved, the way she tilted her head and reached out for me, it was her, or what was left of her. The shadows surged forward, curling toward me like tendrils, and I turned to run. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. The whispers returned, louder now, their voices overlapping, chasing me through the trees. The forest twisted around me, the paths closing in, the branches clawing at my face and arms. The ground beneath me felt like it was moving, shifting with every step, trying to drag me down. I didn't know how long I ran. Time felt meaningless, the seconds stretching into eternity, but eventually the trees began to thin, and the mist grew lighter. The whispers faded, the air growing still, and I stumbled into another clearing, collapsing onto my knees. The lake was there. Its surface was impossibly still, a perfect mirror reflecting the darkened sky above. The mist hung low over the water, swirling lazily, and the air was cold, biting into my skin. I stared at the lake, my chest heaving, and for a moment I thought I saw something move beneath the surface, a shadow, deep and dark, coiling like a serpent. A voice broke the silence, soft and familiar. "You were never meant to leave." I turned sharply, my heart pounding, and saw a figure standing at the edge of the lake. It wasn't Sarah. It wasn't anyone I recognized. It was me. It was me, or something that looked like me. It stood motionless, its face blank, its eyes dark and empty, and it smiled. The reflection stepped forward, and the water began to ripple, the surface breaking as more figures emerged. Identical copies, their faces twisted and wrong, their bodies moving with the same jerky, unnatural rhythm. They reached for me, their hands clawing at the air, and the whispers returned, deafening now, a chaotic roar that filled my head. I stumbled back, but the ground gave way beneath me, and I fell, the shadows swallowing me whole. The fall wasn't like anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't the rush of air or the tug of gravity. It was nothingness, absolute and unrelenting. I wasn't moving through space. I was being consumed. The shadows around me weren't empty. They were alive, pressing in closer, wrapping around me like a second skin. They weren't just pulling me under. No, they were pulling me apart. I hit the ground hard, the impact jarring every bone in my body. For a moment, I couldn't move. My limbs felt foreign, disconnected, as though they weren't entirely my own anymore. The air was heavy and damp, reeking of rot and something metallic that clung to the back of my throat. My vision blurred, and when I tried to focus, the world around me twisted, shifting like a distorted reflection in rippling water. I wasn't by the lake anymore. Shoo. I wasn't anywhere I could recognize. How do you aim? The ground beneath me pulsed faintly, warm and wet, as though it were alive. The sky above wasn't a sky at all. It was a swirling void, dark and endless, dotted with faint, flickering lights that looked like dying stars. The air hummed with a low, resonant vibration, a sound that seemed to come from inside my head as much as from the space around me. Shapes loomed in the distance, towering and jagged, their outlines shifting as though they couldn't quite decide what they were. They weren't trees or buildings. They were something else, something older, something that shouldn't exist. The shadows writhed at their bases, twisting and curling like smoke caught in a breeze that didn't touch me. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs trembling beneath me, and took a step forward. The ground squelched underfoot, and I looked down to see that it wasn't earth at all. It was something darker, slick and glistening, faint tendrils of mist rising from its surface. I tried not to think about what it might be. I couldn't. If I thought too hard, I'd stop moving, and I knew I couldn't stop. Not here. No. The whispers returned, faint at first, threading through the low hum that filled the air. They were different now, calmer, almost soothing, though their words were still impossible to make out. They came from everywhere and nowhere, threading through the fabric of this impossible place, pulling at my thoughts. I clenched my fists, trying to drown them out, but they only grew louder. Ahead of me, the shapes became clearer. They weren't solid. They were shifting, flickering in and out of focus, like static on a broken screen. As I moved closer, I saw them for what they were, reflections. They were people, or something close to people, their forms distorted, their faces warped and incomplete. They moved slowly, aimlessly, their bodies flickering with each step, as though they weren't fully there. One of them turned toward me. Its face was blank, smooth and featureless, but I could feel its gaze. It didn't need eyes to see me. The air around it rippled, the shadows drawing closer, and it tilted its head, its movements slow and deliberate. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though urging it forward. I backed away, my pulse hammering in my chest, but the ground shifted beneath me, pulling me closer. The figure took a step toward me, its limbs jerking awkwardly, and I realized it wasn't alone. More of them were emerging from the shadows, their forms twisting and flickering, their blank faces all turned toward me. The hum deepened, vibrating through the air, and I felt something behind me, a presence massive and suffocating, pressing down on me with a weight that made it hard to breathe. I turned slowly, my chest tightening, and saw it. The lake was here, or at least something like it. Its surface stretched endlessly, dark and glassy, reflecting the swirling void above. The shadows coiled along its edges, their movements slow and deliberate, as though they were waiting. In the center of the water, something stirred. A ripple spread outward, breaking the perfect stillness, and I felt the pull again, stronger this time, dragging me forward. The figures surrounded me now, their blank faces staring, their bodies blocking any chance of escape. The whispers filled the air, louder and louder, until they weren't whispers anymore. They were screams, distorted, overlapping, a cacophony of voices that threatened to tear my mind apart. The ripple in the lake grew larger, and the water began to churn. A shape emerged from the depths, massive and shifting, its edges impossible to define. It wasn't a figure. It wasn't human. It was something older, something vast and infinite, a presence that defied comprehension. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The hum deepened, the vibrations shaking the ground, and the figures around me fell to their knees, their bodies flickering violently before dissolving into shadows. The presence in the lake grew stronger, its shape towering over me, and I realized with a sinking dread that it wasn't just watching me, it knew me. The whispers stopped, the silence more deafening than the screams had been, and the presence reached for me. It didn't have hands, not in the way I understood, but its touch was unmistakable. It wrapped around me, pulling me closer to the water's edge, and I felt the air leave my lungs, the cold seeping into my skin. "You were always mine," the voice said, though it didn't speak. The words were inside me, resonating through every thought, every memory. The water rose to meet me, and as it pulled me under, I saw my reflection again. It wasn't me this time. It was the figure, its face blank, its eyes dark and empty. It smiled, and the world dissolved into darkness. The darkness wasn't silent this time. It throbbed with sound, deep and resonant, a vibration that I felt in my chest more than I heard with my ears. It wasn't empty either. It moved, shifted, alive with something I couldn't see but could feel in every nerve, every inch of my skin. I wasn't floating. I wasn't falling. I was suspended, held in place by the weight of the void, the suffocating presence, pressing in from every side. And then the light came. It wasn't bright. It didn't blind me or push back the dark. It was faint, a dull, pulsing glow that illuminated the outlines of the space around me. The ground beneath me was no longer liquid or solid. It was both, shifting like waves, frozen mid-motion. Shapes moved in the distance, flickering shadows that seemed to ripple with the same rhythm as the light. The air was thick, oppressive, but I could breathe, barely. I stood, my legs trembling, my body aching with a cold that didn't feel natural. The whispers returned, faint at first, threading through the hum that pulsed in time with the light. They weren't frantic now. They were deliberate, layered, like voices in prayer. Each word was unintelligible, but I understood the meaning, the weight of them sinking into my mind like stones. You are here. You have always been here. The space around me began to shift, the shadows stretching and twisting as though they were being pulled by unseen hands. The ground beneath me rippled, and I realized I wasn't alone. They emerged slowly, their forms flickering at the edges, the same featureless figures I had seen before. But there were more now, countless more. They surrounded me, their blank faces turned toward me, their movements synchronized as though they were connected by an unseen thread. The hum deepened, vibrating through the ground, and I felt the pull again. It wasn't just in my body this time. It was in my mind, my thoughts bending under the weight of it. The figures stepped closer, their heads tilting in unison, and the light above pulsed brighter. I wanted to run, to scream, to fight, but my body refused to move. My breath came in shallow gasps, my chest tight with the weight of the air. Ah, Dune. The figures stopped, and the light shifted. It wasn't above me anymore. It was ahead, distant but growing, its dull glow spreading across the horizon like the first crack of dawn. But this wasn't the sun. It was something else, something alive. The figures parted, and I felt the weight of their gaze, or whatever passed for it, pressing against my back as I moved forward, drawn to the light. Each step felt heavier than the last, the ground sinking beneath my feet, pulling me deeper into the space. The whispers grew louder, the voices overlapping, a chaotic symphony that filled my head with words I couldn't understand, but couldn't ignore. And then I saw it. The lake stretched out before me, vast and endless, its surface glowing faintly with the same pulsing light. The water wasn't water anymore. It was alive, rippling and shifting, the shadows beneath it writhing like a mass of coiled serpents. The air above it shimmered, distorted, as though reality itself was bending around it. At the center of the lake, the light grew brighter, and I saw the shape of it. The thing that had been watching me, pulling me here. It wasn't a figure, not like the others. It was something larger, older, its form impossible to comprehend. It wasn't one shape, but many, shifting and overlapping, its edges flickering like static. It pulsed with the rhythm of the hum, its presence filling the air, the ground, the water. It spoke without words, its voice inside me, around me, through me. You were made for this. Elle, you were made for this. The water surged, and I stumbled back, my feet slipping on the slick ground. The shadows beneath the surface coiled tighter, their forms stretching upward, reaching for me. I tried to turn, to run, but the pull was stronger now, dragging me forward, closer to the edge. My body didn't feel like my own anymore. My limbs moved without thought, each step pulling me closer, to the center of the lake. The figures were behind me, their forms still and silent, watching as I approached the water. The light grew brighter, the hum louder, until it was all I could hear, all I could feel. My chest burned with the effort to breathe, my thoughts unraveling as the presence of the lake filled my mind, pushing everything else away. I reached the edge, and the water rippled, the shadows beneath it parting to reveal something beneath the surface. It was a reflection, but not of me. It was the figure I'd seen in the house, the one that had taken my face. It stared up at me from the water, its blank eyes empty and infinite, its mouth twisted into a smile that didn't belong to me. The presence in the lake surged, and I felt it wrap around me, pulling me forward. The water rose to meet me, and I saw my reflection smile as the surface broke, swallowing me whole. Ah, I didn't drown. The water filled my lungs, my veins, my thoughts, but I didn't die. I was pulled deeper, the light above me fading as the shadows closed in, wrapping around me like a cocoon. The whispers were inside me now, their voices threading through my mind, weaving together something new. I wasn't myself anymore. I wasn't anything. And then I was everything. The lake was gone. The figures were gone. The light was gone. There was only the hum, deep and resonant, filling the void that stretched endlessly around me. I didn't have a body anymore, but I could feel the pull, the presence of something vast and infinite, something that had always been there, waiting. Waiting. You are the lake now, the voice said. And I understood. I was the water, the shadows, the whispers, the hum. Why, bon, adios, patriol, egres. I was the thing that pulled others here, that showed them their own reflections, their own truths. I was the void, the endless, the inescapable, and I would wait for the next one. The rain hammered against the windshield with a relentless rhythm, the wipers doing little to clear the downpour. The GPS had stopped working an hour ago, leaving me to navigate the winding mountain roads with nothing but an ominous sense of direction and a faint glow of headlights ahead. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, the edges of my fingers tingling with unease. The invitation clutched on the passenger seat promised a unique experience, but there was no detail. Just coordinates, a date, and the name of a hotel I'd never heard of. When I finally arrived, the building emerged from the fog like a specter. The architecture was ornate, but decayed. The kind of place that might have been grand a century ago, but now stood as a crumbling relic of forgotten times. Ivy crawled up its stone facade, and broken windows revealed darkness within. A single light flickered above the main entrance, casting jagged shadows on the rain-slicked steps. I hesitated before stepping out of the car. The air felt heavy, pressing against my chest, as though the storm itself carried some weight I couldn't define. Still, something compelled me forward. A mix of curiosity and dread, an invisible thread pulling me toward the unknown. Inside, the lobby was dimly lit by a massive chandelier, its crystals dulled by time and neglect. The floor creaked underfoot, and the faint scent of mildew mixed with something metallic lingered in the air. A wooden counter stood at the far end, but no one was there to greet me. Instead, a small bell sat on the counter, its brass tarnished and green. I reached out and rang it, the chime echoing unnaturally loud in the emptiness. The sound stirred the shadows. It's main. I turned sharply, convinced someone was behind me, but there was only the vast emptiness of the lobby. As I waited, I noticed the walls adorned with old photographs, faces frozen in black and white, their expressions unnervingly blank. The eyes seemed to follow me as I moved, their gazes accusatory, expectant. I glanced at my phone again. No signal, no messages, no escape. That's when I noticed it. The main door I had entered through was gone. Not locked. Gone. The wall where it had been was now seamless, as if it had never existed. My breath caught in my throat, and my stomach turned with a nauseating lurch. I wasn't alone. No. A faint sound came from the second floor, a soft shuffle like feet dragging across carpet. My eyes darted toward the grand staircase that spiraled upward into darkness. Every instinct told me to leave, to find another way out, but my feet moved toward the staircase as if propelled by something outside my control. The steps groaned beneath me, each creak resonating like a warning. The air grew colder as I ascended, my breath condensing in thin wisps that floated briefly before vanishing. At the top, a long hallway stretched out, lined with doors that looked identical. Their numbers were tarnished, some missing entirely. At the far end, a single bulb flickered weakly, casting erratic shadows that seemed to twist and writhe. I approached the nearest door and hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, slick with sweat, as an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. I told myself it was just a room, just another space within this decaying structure. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt an unexplainable certainty. When I finally turned the knob and pushed the door open, the room was empty. Empty, save for a single chair positioned in the center, facing a full-length mirror. The chair was old and wooden, its surface scarred by scratches and what looked like deep gouges. The mirror was cracked, its fractured surface distorting my reflection into a grotesque mosaic. And then I saw it, not in the mirror, but in the reflection of the room behind me. A figure, tall and cloaked in shadow, standing just inside the doorway. I spun around, my heart pounding in my ears, but there was nothing there. The room was empty again, save for the oppressive silence. That's when I noticed a chair. It was no longer empty. A shape sat hunched in it now, its face obscured by long matted hair. Its hands, if they were hands, gripped the arms of the chair with knotted skeletal fingers. My body locked in place, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure raised its head slowly, the hair parting just enough to reveal hollow sockets where eyes should have been. Its mouth opened, but no sound came out. Only a void, black and endless, as though it was swallowing the very light around it. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. I stumbled backward, my chest heaving as I gasped for air. The chair was empty once more, but the mirror, oh God, the mirror, showed me still standing there. Only, my reflection didn't match my movements. It stared back at me with a twisted grin, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. I turned and fled, my footsteps echoing as I raced back into the hallway. But the corridor stretched endlessly now, the flickering bulb growing fainter with each step. The walls began to close in, their surfaces twisting and pulsating like something alive. The whispers started then, soft at first, then louder, surrounding me in a cacophony of voices I couldn't understand. No escape. They seemed to say, "You're already part of it." My legs gave out, and I collapsed to my knees. Collapsed to my knees. The floor beneath me felt warm and wet, and when I looked down, I saw it wasn't wood at all. It was flesh, pulsating and alive, oozing a dark, viscous liquid that clung to my hands. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me whole was the faint outline of a door at the end of the hall, glowing faintly like a dying ember, a door that didn't belong, a door that might be my only way out, or my final mistake. The hallway stretched before me like an endless wound, the faint glow of the door at its end, pulsing dimly as though mocking my desperation. The whispers hadn't stopped. They slithered around me, each word indistinct, yet clawing at my sanity. My breath came in shallow gasps, my chest heaving against the suffocating air. I didn't want to move, but the alternative, staying still in that grotesque, pulsating corridor, felt even worse. I stumbled forward, each step met with the slick, fleshy squelch of the floor beneath me. The walls seemed to writhe, their surface undulating like waves of muscle, and the faint metallic tang in the air turned sharper, heavier, until it coated the back of my throat. My fingers brushed against one of the walls, and I recoiled instantly, the sensation of something warm and wet clinging to my skin. It wasn't the rotted wood of an old building. It was alive. The corridor began to change. The flickering light overhead dimmed further, until I was left in near total darkness, relying on the faint glow of the distant door to guide me. But as I moved closer, the door seemed to retreat, as though mocking my every effort. I turned to look behind me, hoping against all reason that I might see the staircase or some tangible escape, but the corridor had closed in on itself. There was no going back. Then came the first sound, a low, guttural groan, distant but resonating, like a deep vibration through the walls. It wasn't human, not entirely. The noise made my skin crawl, my instincts flaring with an ancient, primal terror. I froze, my feet rooted to the floor, and strained to hear more. But the silence that followed was almost worse. A sudden chill rushed past me, cutting through the oppressive heat of the air. It felt like a hand, skeletal and ice-cold, grazing the back of my neck. I spun around, expecting to see someone or something, but there was only the darkness, now heavier and deeper than before. I forced myself to move, each step more labored than the last, as though the hallway itself was trying to hold me back. And then I saw them. Doors, dozens of them, lining the hallway where there had been none before. Each door was identical, warped and stained with time, their tarnished brass knobs dull and lifeless. The whispers grew louder as I passed each one, their voices swelling into a cacophony of chaos. They weren't speaking to me. They were arguing, frantic and desperate, 100 voices overlapping and rising in pitch, until I couldn't tell if the noise was outside my head or within it. I stopped, in front of one door, drawn to it for reasons I couldn't explain. It was slightly ajar, a faint sliver of light spilling out from the crack. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob, the voices growing deafening now, screaming for me to stop, to turn away, to run. But I didn't. The door swung open with a creak, revealing a room that defied all logic. It wasn't like the first one I'd entered. This one was smaller, claustrophobic, with walls covered in cracked mirrors that reflected not my image, but something else. Shadows, figures, moving just out of reach, their distorted limbs writhing as though trying to break free. The air inside was heavy, stifling, and the faint scent of decay hit me like a blow. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it sat an object, a tarnished, ornate key. The key was wrapped in what looked like hair, thick and black, coiled tightly around its length. I hesitated, the sight of it filling me with a deep, inexplicable revulsion. But I knew, somehow, that I needed it. I stepped closer, the floor beneath me creaking with every step. As I reached out to take the key, the whispers stopped. Silence. Pandikiumoi, Hedalis, Willisfeber, Tupushu. Heavy, oppressive silence, as though the entire building was holding its breath. My fingers brushed the key, and the hair around it unraveled, slithering away like a living thing. The moment I touched it, the mirrors around me shattered in unison, the sound like 1,000 screams tearing through the air. I bolted out of the room, clutching the key so tightly it bit into my palm. Then, the hallway had changed again, the walls narrowing and bending at impossible angles. The doors were gone, replaced by jagged, uneven openings that led to nothing but black voids. The whispers returned, louder now, their voices overlapping into a chorus of despair. "You don't belong here," one voice hissed, cutting through the others like a knife. Move. It was clearer than the rest, more tangible, as though it was speaking directly into my ear. I tried to run, but my legs felt sluggish, as though the air itself had thickened. The corridor twisted around me, the floor tilting and buckling beneath my feet. I stumbled, falling to my knees, the key tumbling from my hand. When I looked up, the door was there again, the one I'd been chasing, but something was standing in front of it now. A figure, impossibly tall and shrouded in shadow, its edges blurred like smoke, its head tilted, its form bending unnaturally as it stepped closer. Now, it stepped closer. My body refused to move, my muscles locked in place, as though paralyzed by the sheer weight of its presence. It didn't speak, but I could feel its intent, its hunger, pressing against my mind like a crushing wave. And then, without warning, it lunged. I don't know how I managed to move. Some primal instinct kicked in, and I grabbed the key, scrambling to my feet. The figure was on me, its shadowy limbs stretching and twisting, reaching for me with impossible speed. I ran, the hallway blurring around me, the door growing closer with each step. I could feel the thing behind me, its presence like a cold fire licking at my skin. The key fit perfectly into the lock. As I turned it, the door swung open, revealing nothing but darkness on the other side. I hesitated, the whispers screaming now, begging me not to go through, but the thing behind me was closing in, its breath cold against the back of my neck. With no other choice, I stepped through, and the door slammed shut behind me. The darkness was absolute. It consumed everything, leaving me in a void so deep it felt as though my body had been swallowed whole. My breathing was ragged, the sound too loud, too sharp, against the oppressive silence. I reached out blindly, my hands brushing against nothingness. But the sensation of being watched, of something lurking just beyond my reach, was overwhelming. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, the pounding growing louder, until it merged with the silence, creating a dreadful rhythm that I couldn't escape. Then, a faint light emerged, a pinprick in the distance. It flickered weakly, like a dying candle, but it was enough to pull me forward. My feet moved without thought, the floor beneath them rough and uneven. Each step sent echoes reverberating through the emptiness, as if the void itself was mocking my movements. The whispers returned, faint at first, but growing steadily louder with each step. "Closer," they hissed. "It's waiting." I didn't want to go close. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to turn back, to run. But there was nowhere to go. The door behind me was gone, sealed away, as if it had never existed. Forward was the only option, no matter how much dread clawed at my chest. The light grew brighter as I approached, revealing a space that defied logic. The walls seemed to fold in on themselves, their surfaces shifting between jagged stone and smooth, glistening flesh. The air was thick and humid, carrying the scent of decay and something acrid that stung my nostrils. In the center of the room was a table, its surface cracked and stained, and on it lay a leather-bound book. The book was ancient, its cover worn and cracked, the edges frayed as though it had been gnawed on. Symbols were etched into the leather, symbols I couldn't recognize, but that filled me with an inexplicable unease. They seemed to writhe when I looked at them, shifting and twisting like living things. I didn't want to touch it, but as I stepped closer, the whispers grew louder, insistent, demanding. "Open it," they urged. "See the truth." My hands shook as I reached for the book. The leather was cold, slick to the touch, as though it had been submerged in water. When I opened it, the pages were blank at first, their surface yellowed and brittle. But as I turned them, words began to appear, scrawling themselves across the paper in dark, jagged script. The language was foreign, the symbols alien, yet somehow I understood. The book told the story of the hotel, or whatever this place truly was. It spoke of rituals performed in secret, of sacrifices made to appease a force older than time itself. The words bled onto the pages, describing horrors beyond comprehension. Figures cloaked in shadow, their faces obscured, chanting in unison as the walls around them bled. It spoke of the guests who had come before me, drawn here by forces they couldn't resist, their fates sealed the moment they crossed the threshold. And it spoke of me. My name appeared on the page, written in the same jagged script. My breath caught in my throat as the words shifted, rearranging themselves into a message meant just for me. "You are the key." The book snapped, shut on its own, the sound reverberating through the room like a gunshot. The light flickered violently, and the air grew colder, the chill biting into my skin. I backed away from the table, the book still clutched in my hands, but the whispers were deafening now, overlapping and incoherent. Then I heard it again, the groan, low and guttural, vibrating through the walls. It was closer this time, and I realized with a sickening certainty that I wasn't alone. Something was moving in the shadows, its form barely visible in the flickering light. It was massive, its shape shifting and amorphous, like smoke given weight and form. Eyes, too many eyes, blinked at me from within its dark mass, each one glinting with malevolence. I stumbled backward, clutching the book to my chest, as though it could protect me. The thing moved closer, its limbs, if they could be called that, stretching toward me with an unnatural grace. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body was frozen, rooted to the spot as the creature loomed over me. And it spoke. "You were chosen," it said, its voice a chorus of tones that scraped against my mind like broken glass. "You cannot leave. You belong to it now." I don't remember running, only the sensation of my legs moving beneath me, my heart pounding as the whispers rose to a crescendo. The hallway reappeared before me, impossibly long and twisting, the walls pulsing like veins, doors lined either side, their surfaces warped and splintered, each one exuding a palpable sense of wrongness. I threw myself against the first door I saw, desperate to escape the thing chasing me. The room inside was small and suffocating, its walls covered in old photographs. Faces stared back at me, their eyes hollow and accusing, their mouths twisted into expressions of pain and terror. I recognized some of them: the man from the lobby, the figure from the chair. They weren't just photographs. They were the victims, their souls trapped within the glossy surface. The door slammed shut behind me, and I realized, too late, that I had trapped myself. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so deep it was suffocating. I turned to face the door, but it was no longer there. The walls began to close in, the photographs shifting and twisting as the faces moved, their expressions contorting in agony. "You can't leave," they whispered, their voices overlapping and echoing in the small space. "You're already part of it." The air grew heavier, pressing against my chest until I could barely breathe. My vision blurred, and the last thing I saw before everything went black was my own reflection in one of the photographs, my face staring back at me, twisted into the same expression of terror as the others. When I woke, the world was wrong. The walls around me weren't the same ones I had seen before I lost consciousness. They pulsed, not like flesh, but like something deeper, something alive yet hollow. Empty. The air felt colder, but it wasn't the chill of weather. It was a cold that came from within, from the spaces between what was real and what wasn't. I pulled myself upright, my hands trembling against the uneven ground, and tried to focus. The book was gone. My chest tightened at the realization. I made eerie. I had clung to it as if it were the only anchor to something tangible. But now I was alone again, and the void within the room seemed to press closer. I blinked, and the walls shifted slightly, the texture rippling as though responding to my gaze. I was no longer sure if I was inside the hotel or somewhere else entirely, somewhere worse. Oi! A single light flickered above me, casting weak, erratic flashes across the space. I turned slowly, scanning for anything. A door, a passage, an escape. But the room was featureless. No furniture, no photographs, just smooth, undulating walls. I moved toward one, pressing my hand against it, but the surface gave under my touch, yielding like soft clay. It felt alive, like muscle beneath skin, and I yanked my hand back with a shudder. Then I heard it, a sound like footsteps, but distorted, as though they were coming from multiple places at once. They were slow, deliberate, and growing closer. My heart raced as I spun toward the source, but there was nothing there, just the flickering light and the oppressive walls. Still, the sound persisted, relentless, echoing in a way that made my head ache. "You're not real," I whispered to myself. the words barely audible over the pounding in my ears. This isn't real. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, sharper, until it wasn't footsteps anymore, but a rhythmic pounding, like a heartbeat, amplified and distorted. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the walls. The pounding grew stronger, and the walls around me began to shift, folding inward like paper, crumpling under invisible hands. The light above me flickered violently, then died, plunging the room into darkness. And then the whispers began again. "You don't belong here," they said, their voices overlapping and twisting into a single malevolent tone. "But you can't leave." I ran. Tuck. I don't remember which direction I chose, or how I even found an exit, but my body moved on instinct, driven by the primal need to escape. The ground beneath me shifted with each step, sometimes solid, sometimes giving way as if I were running across sand. The air grew thicker, every breath feeling like a struggle, and the whispers followed me, taunting, laughing. When I burst through the doorway, if it could even be called that, I stumbled into a hallway unlike any I had seen before. The walls were lined with clocks, hundreds of them, all ticking in perfect unison. The sound was maddening, a relentless symphony of time moving forward, backward, sideways. Each clock was different. Some modern, others ancient, their hands spinning in impossible directions. The whispers faded, replaced by a deep, echoing voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Time bends here," it said, the words heavy and deliberate. "It does not belong to you." I stared at the clocks, mesmerized and horrified. In their glass faces, I saw flashes of myself, not just the me standing there, but other versions. One where I was older, my face lined with exhaustion. One where I was younger, eyes wide with fear. One where I wasn't me at all, my features twisted into something unrecognizable, something monstrous. Each reflection moved independently, their actions detached from my own, and I felt a sickening pull, as though they were reaching for me, trying to drag me into their world. I turned away, my head spinning. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, the ticking growing louder with every step I took. The floor beneath me was no longer solid. It shifted, warped, sometimes feeling like stone, sometimes like water. I couldn't trust my senses anymore, but I had no choice but to keep moving. That's when I saw the first figure. It stood at the far end of the hallway, motionless, its back to me. It was human-shaped but wrong, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The ticking slowed, each beat reverberating through the air like a drum, and the figure began to turn. I froze, my breath caught in my throat as it faced me. It was me, or at least, it was something that looked like me. A grotesque parody with sunken eyes and a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far across its face. It raised a hand, its fingers impossibly thin and elongated, and pointed at me. My legs refused to move, my body paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of it. "You've been here before," it said, its voice a hollow echo of my own, "and you'll be here again." The lights flickered, and the figure was gone. My knees gave out, and I collapsed to the floor, the cold surface sending a shiver through me. I didn't know how long I sat there, the sound of the clocks hammering in my ears. But when I finally looked up, the hallway had changed again. There were no clocks now, only doors, endless rows of them, each identical to the last, their surfaces smooth and black. The air was heavier here, pressing against my chest like a weight. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me, and moved toward the nearest door. The handle was cold, almost painfully so, and when I turned it, the door swung open with a low creak. Inside was a room, much like the one I had woken in, featureless, shifting, alive. But at its center was a single object, a mirror. I stepped inside, drawn to it despite the gnawing dread in my chest. The mirror's surface was cracked, the fractures spidering out like veins, but I could still see my reflection. Only, it wasn't me, not entirely. My reflection stood taller, its posture rigid, its eyes hollow and black. It raised a hand, and I mirrored the motion instinctively, but then it smiled. A cold, empty grin that made my stomach churn. Before I could react, the mirror shattered, and the room went dark. The darkness that swallowed me after the mirror shattered wasn't like before. This wasn't the absence of light. It was a living thing, pressing against my skin, wrapping itself around me like a suffocating shroud. It wasn't just the absence of vision. It was the absence of everything. My senses dulled, my breath slowed, and for a moment I wasn't sure if I was even alive. Then, with an almost violent abruptness, the world returned. I was no longer in the room. Et alaitua, sui, there stay. The floor beneath me was cold stone, rough and uneven, and the air was damp, heavy with the stench of rot. My head throbbed with a deep, pulsating ache, and my ears were filled with a faint, rhythmic dripping that echoed in the distance. I forced myself to my feet, the weight of the darkness still lingering, and looked around. I was in a corridor, narrow and ancient, with walls made of crumbling brick that oozed a dark, tar-like substance. The dim glow of torches flickered along the walls, casting uneven shadows that seemed to move on their own. The ceiling arched high above me, disappearing into shadow, and the dripping sound grew louder as I took my first cautious steps forward. The torches were wrong. Their flames weren't natural. They burned cold, with a strange bluish hue, and their light didn't behave like it should. The shadows they cast were jagged and unnatural, stretching and twisting in ways that made my stomach churn. They flickered erratically, as though responding to something unseen, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me. The corridor stretched on endlessly, each step feeling like a battle against the oppressive weight of the air. The dripping grew louder, more insistent, and as I turned a corner, I found the source. A massive archway loomed before me, its edges carved with symbols that seemed to pulse with their own internal light. Beyond it was a cavernous space, its ceiling lost to darkness, and its walls lined with what looked like hundreds of twisted, gnarled roots. In the center of the room was a pit, wide and yawning, and from it flowed a thick black liquid that pooled on the stone floor and dripped into narrow grooves carved into the rock. The grooves formed a pattern, a sprawling, intricate design that stretched across the entire cavern, and the sight of it made my skin crawl. I wanted to turn back, but the corridor behind me was gone. The walls had shifted, closing in on themselves, leaving me with no choice but to step into the cavern. As I crossed the threshold, the symbols on the archway flared brightly, and the air grew heavier, almost too thick to breathe. That's when I saw it. The figure was standing at the far side of the pit, its back to me. It was tall, impossibly so, and cloaked in a blackness that seemed to devour the faint light of the torches. Its form was indistinct, its edges blurred and shifting, but I could feel its presence, an overwhelming, suffocating force that pressed down on me with a weight that made my knees tremble. It didn't move, but I could feel its attention shift toward me. The air grew colder, and the shadows on the walls began to writhe, twisting and coiling like serpents. I took a step back, but my foot slipped on the slick black liquid, and I stumbled. The sound of my movement seemed deafening in the oppressive silence, and the figure turned. Its face, or what passed for a face, was a void, an absence of features that seemed to pull at the edges of reality itself. The longer I looked at it, the more the world around me seemed to distort, bending and twisting as though reality was struggling to hold itself together. "You shouldn't be here," it said, its voice a low, guttural growl that seemed to resonate through the very air. "But you are. Shoo, eduvel, enukha." The pit behind it began to churn, the black liquid bubbling and frothing as though something massive was stirring beneath the surface. The grooves carved into the floor began to glow faintly, the light spreading outward in jagged lines that pulsed like veins. I turned to run, but the walls of the cavern had shifted, closing in to form a solid barrier. There was nowhere to go. My heart pounded as the figure began to move toward me, its steps slow and deliberate, each one sending a ripple through the liquid on the floor. "You were chosen," it said, the words scraping against my mind like nails on a chalkboard. "And you will serve." The pit erupted. A massive shape emerged from the darkness, its form impossible to comprehend. It was all jagged edges and writhing limbs, a mass of blackness that seemed to swallow the light around it. Its presence filled the cavern, its sheer size overwhelming, and I felt my knees buckle beneath me as its gaze turned toward me. The figure standing by the pit raised an arm, and the grooves on the floor flared brightly, the light racing toward me in sharp, jagged lines. When it reached me, the light seared into my skin, burning with an intensity that left me gasping for air. The pain was unlike anything I'd ever felt, and for a moment I thought it would consume me entirely. But then everything stopped. The cavern went silent, the light dimmed, and the figure stepped back, its form dissolving into the shadows. The massive shape in the pit sank back into the darkness, leaving only the faint ripple of the liquid. As it settled, "You cannot escape," the voice echoed, though there was no one left to speak. "You are part of it now." And then the floor beneath me gave way. The sensation of falling wasn't like I expected. It wasn't the rush of air or the weightless terror I imagined. It was worse. It felt like being dragged, torn from one reality and thrust into another, each second stretching unbearably. The darkness clung to me, dense and suffocating, and the cold cut deeper than skin, settling into my bones. I tried to scream, but no sound came. It was as though the void itself had swallowed my voice. And I landed. The impact wasn't physical. It was something else entirely. The ground beneath me felt wrong. Not solid, but not soft either. It was like standing on something that wanted to reject me, pushing back with every step. I blinked, trying to adjust to the dim, murky light that seemed to seep from the walls themselves, casting everything in a sickly greenish glow. I was in another hallway. No, not a hallway. A tunnel. The walls were rough, carved from jagged stone, and they pulsed faintly, as though alive. The air was damp and filled with a low, constant hum that vibrated in my chest. Far ahead, a faint light flickered, barely visible through the haze. I forced myself to move, every step heavy and deliberate. The ground squelched beneath my feet, slick with some unidentifiable substance that glistened in the faint light. But the sound of my footsteps echoed strangely, doubling back on themselves as if the tunnel were mocking me. The hum grew louder as I moved forward, taking on a rhythm that reminded me of a heartbeat, slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud. Then I saw them. New figures lined the walls, their bodies fused into the stone as though they'd been trapped mid-scream. Their faces were twisted in agony, their mouths open wide but silent. Their hands jutted out at odd angles, clawing at the air, frozen in eternal desperation. I stopped, my stomach churning, and reached out instinctively to touch one of them. The surface of the stone was warm, almost feverish, and I yanked my hand back, bile rising in my throat. "You shouldn't linger." "Dad." The voice was soft, almost gentle, but it sent a jolt of terror through me. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was no one there. The tunnel stretched behind me, empty and silent. The figures on the walls hadn't moved, but their expressions seemed different now, more knowing, more aware. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and turned to keep moving. The light ahead grew brighter as I approached, and I realized it wasn't a single source, but a series of torches, their flames burning the same cold blue as before. They lined the entrance to a massive chamber, the tunnel opening up into a space so vast it seemed impossible. The ceiling stretched high above, lost in darkness, and the walls were lined with more of those grotesque, frozen figures, their bodies twisting into impossible shapes. In the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, and on it lay an object, a knife. It wasn't like any knife I'd ever seen. The blade was long and jagged, carved from something that looked like bone, and the hilt was wrapped in a material that shimmered like liquid. Symbols were etched into the blade, glowing faintly, and as I stepped closer, I felt a strange pull, an almost magnetic force drawing me toward it. "You know what you must do." The voice came again, louder this time, and I turned sharply, my eyes darting around the chamber. It was empty. Completely empty, but the air felt heavy, oppressive, as though I was being watched from every angle. "Take it," the voice urged, and I realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was in my head, pressing against the edges of my thoughts, invading the space where my fear lived. Ow! I stepped closer to the pedestal, my body moving as if under someone else's control. The knife pulsed faintly, the glow of its symbols syncing with the rhythm of the heartbeat that still echoed through the chamber. My hand reached out, trembling, and I hesitated. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping and chaotic, filling the chamber with a cacophony of noise. "Take it," the voice demanded, sharper now, insistent. "Or it will take you." I didn't understand what that meant, but the urgency in the voice was undeniable. My fingers closed around the hilt, and the moment I lifted the knife, the chamber changed. The walls began to move, the figures embedded within them writhing and twisting as though they were alive. Their mouths opened wide, and they screamed. Silent, soundless screams that tore through the air and into my mind. The floor beneath me trembled, and the heartbeat grew faster, pounding with a force that made my vision blur. And then the pedestal sank into the ground, leaving only the knife in my hand. The glow of the symbols grew brighter, and the blade felt warm, almost alive, as though it were pulsing in sync with the heartbeat. I turned instinctively, and that's when I saw it. A shape emerged from the far end of the chamber, stepping out of the shadows with a deliberate, unnatural grace. It was massive, its form shifting and indistinct, and its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed with a cold, white light. The air grew colder as it approached, and the shadows around it seemed to stretch and reach toward me. It didn't speak, but its presence was overwhelming, pressing against me like a physical weight. I raised the knife instinctively, and the symbols flared brightly, illuminating the chamber in a harsh, unnatural light. The creature stopped, its form flickering like static, and for a moment I thought it was afraid. But then it lunged. The force of its attack knocked me backward, and I hit the ground hard, the knife slipping from my grip. The creature loomed over me, its shifting form blocking out the light, and I felt its presence invade my mind, a torrent of thoughts and images I couldn't understand, couldn't process. It was speaking to me, not in words, but in raw emotion, in fear and despair and hunger. I scrambled for the knife, my fingers closing around the hilt, just as the creature reached for me. The blade flared again, and this time the creature recoiled, its form flickering more violently. I didn't think. I drove the knife upward, plunging it into the mass of shadows, and the chamber erupted in light. The scream that followed wasn't silent. It was deafening, a piercing wail that shattered the air and drove me to my knees. The creature dissolved, its form collapsing in on itself, and the light from the knife dimmed. The chamber fell silent again, and I was left alone, clutching the blade as my breath came in ragged gasps. But the voice remained, soft, insistent. It's not over. The silence that followed was unbearable. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was the absence of life itself. A void that pressed against me with a suffocating weight. I knelt there on the cold, trembling ground, clutching the knife like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. The glow of its symbols had faded now, leaving the blade cold and inert in my hand. Yet, even as the chamber stilled, I could feel the air vibrating with something I couldn't name. I stood slowly, my legs shaking, and looked around. The creature was gone. Its form had dissolved into nothingness, but the walls of the chamber bore the marks of its presence. The figures trapped within the stone had gone still, their twisted faces frozen once again. But their eyes weren't empty anymore. They were watching me, following my every movement with a silent, accusing stare. I turned away, my stomach twisting, and moved toward the far end of the chamber. There was another archway there, identical to the one I'd entered through, but this one was different. The symbols carved into its surface glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with the distant heartbeat that had never stopped. The air around it shimmered, distorted, as though the space beyond it wasn't entirely real. I didn't want to go through it. Every instinct screamed at me to stay away, to turn back, to find another way. But there was no turning back. The chamber behind me was closing in, the walls shifting and twisting as though they were alive, and the faint whispers were returning, growing louder with each passing second. I gripped the knife tighter and stepped through the archway. The transition was immediate, like stepping through a curtain of ice. The air on the other side was colder, heavier, and the light was dim and strange, casting everything in an unnatural hue. The ground beneath me was no longer stone. It was something soft, yielding, like the surface of a dried-out lakebed. The whispers were louder here, but they weren't chaotic anymore. They were deliberate, a single voice speaking in fragments that I couldn't quite understand. Ahead of me was a pathway, narrow and winding, flanked on either side by sheer drops into an endless abyss. The walls of the tunnel seemed to stretch and contract, their surfaces glistening as though coated in oil. The knife felt heavier in my hand, the symbols flickering faintly, and I realized, with a sinking feeling, that I wasn't alone. The shadows were moving. They clung to the walls, to the edges of the pathway, writhing and shifting, as though alive. They didn't have shape, not entirely, but they had weight. I could feel their presence, their malice, pressing against me from all sides. My breath hitched as I took a step forward, the ground beneath me crunching softly, and the shadows recoiled slightly, retreating into the walls. I kept moving, my steps careful and deliberate, the knife raised in front of me like a shield. The whispers grew louder, the voice becoming clearer, and I realized it wasn't speaking to me. It was speaking about me. "She carries it," the voice said, low and guttural, reverberating through the tunnel. "She is the key." The ground trembled beneath me, and I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadows surged forward, writhing and twisting, forming shapes that defied reason. They were human, but not. Their limbs were too long, their faces stretched into grotesque parodies of humanity, and their eyes burned with a cold, white light. I raised the knife instinctively, and the symbols flared to life, casting a harsh, flickering glow across the tunnel. The shadows recoiled again, hissing and writhing, but they didn't retreat entirely. They hovered at the edges, waiting, watching, as though testing my resolve. The pathway ahead seemed endless, each step heavier than the last. The air was thick, almost solid, and every breath felt like a struggle. The whispers continued, louder now, overlapping and chaotic, and I realized with growing dread that they weren't coming from the walls. They were coming from inside my head. "You cannot escape," the voice said, cold and final. "It will claim you, as it claims all." "Tensul, Walsh, Tanifud, Benes." I stumbled, the weight of the words pressing against me, and fell to my knees. The knife clattered to the ground beside me, its glow dimming, and I felt the shadows surge forward, their forms growing more defined, more human. They reached for me, their elongated fingers stretching out, and I could feel their cold touch against my skin. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. I'm not part of this." The shadows stopped, their movements slowing, and for a moment the whispers ceased. The silence was deafening, a void that pressed against my ears. And then the voice spoke again, softer this time. "You chose this." Yet the ground beneath me began to crack, the dried surface splitting and crumbling, and I could see something moving beneath it, something massive, shifting and pulsing like a heartbeat. The knife pulsed faintly, its symbols flaring one last time, and I realized what I had to do. I picked up the blade, my fingers wrapping tightly around the hilt, and stood. The shadows hesitated, their forms flickering, and I stepped forward, the knife raised. The path ahead was crumbling, the abyss creeping closer with each step. But I didn't stop. The whispers grew louder, more desperate, but I forced myself to keep moving. The end of the path was a doorway, its frame glowing faintly, and beyond it was nothing, just a void, endless and consuming. I stepped through, the knife clutched tightly in my hand, and the world fell away. The darkness that followed wasn't empty, it was alive, pulsing and writhing, and in the center of it was a single blinding light. The voice was there too, louder now, speaking directly to me. "You were never meant to leave. Angers, Hufadawa. The light consumed me, and for a moment I felt everything. The weight of the shadows, the pull of the abyss, the knife's cold resolve. And then it was gone, all of it, and I was left standing in silence, alone, with only the knife in my hand and the whispers echoing in my mind.